say it did kill Gisela, say it did kill Gisela, Osrith continued, her head still turned away. Is this a punishment in proportion to her death? Speak, Osrith implored him. I will have your answer, honest and true as it is. No, her nephew replied, after some time. No, it is not. And Father Oswald got to his feet and picked up Osrith's clothes, handing them to her, one by one, and she dressed quickly. Oswald was waiting beside her when she had finished, and held out an arm. So you see, Osrith said, not taking it immediately. I was aiming for your father, and I saw Idgulf, and I realized at that moment no matter what Utad has ever done to me in vengeance for the death of your mother, it was nothing compared to the callousness, the arrogance, of that lord, in his quest driven by greed for the throne himself. That captain did not have to die. And then she took his arm, and Oswald crossed to the door, banging with his fist on the thick oak panels once, twice, 3 times. Thank you for being honest with me, Aunt, he said to her, and smiled. Does she know you are Utad's eldest son, in his first appointment? Osrith asked. Her nephew smiled. Oh yes, Father Oswald told her. But I could not use the name my father selected for me when he disowned me, my flock would think it most peculiar. That was Judas, Father Judas. It was Osrith's turn to be shocked, and she drew on Oswald's arm and he stepped closer to her, smiling. It matters little to me, though once it did. I thought to our conversation, our last one, a dozen or so year ago, he confided. Oswald is an appropriate name, do you not agree, Aunt? Northumbrian King Chester, our beloved saint far from home, his death at the hands of the last pagan of Mercia. Osrith laughed aloud. It was indeed an wily choice of name which only a few could possibly have understood. And, as the key turned in the lock, Osrith pulled Oswald close to her, and held on to her brother's eldest child like she had not been able to on the day his mother died. You are my kin, Utad, she told him, calling Oswald by his birth name. You are never, and will never be other to me. 88,888,888. Lady of the Mersins, Osrith declared, as they stood before the hall, outside in the courtyard. I am sworn to your land. If you have harmed in any way those men, or had others harm them, I will kill you right here. Osrith put her hand to her cheeks, and glanced across to Athelstan. I take it your father got out of the holding cell at Aylesbury? She whispered across to him. Athelstan said nothing, and it was Ethelfled who spoke and pulled Athelstan away from Osrith. Do you understand the implications of bringing yourself forward with confession of this deed? It was Aldhelm speaking now, and he stood between her and Ethelfled. Best place, Osrith thought, as she tried not to look at everyone assembled before her, everyone who was at Brunanburh. Her brother would be there of course, his men, Ethelfled's household guard. There would be her Merson men, Miral, Elfrith and Constantine's lords. Even the servants would be squeezed amongst them. I do indeed. It is because I am of Mercia that I come before you today. Fellow Mersons, she continued, sensing Ethelfled's irritation. It is because I served the Lord before this lady, they could make of it what they wanted. She meant Ethliad, though many might think Utad, that I acted beyond the law. I should have brought Lord Deirdwulf back to Aylesbury for trial. I did not, and acted out of love for my lord, with emotion, not my head. Look out to the people, Osrith told herself. Make them see you mean all of your words. It is under these circumstances, Osrith continued, that I bring myself to the justice of the land that I love, to have its judgment against me. I would have my lady understand, and here Osrith turned to Ethelfled, that all I did was what I thought was the good of Mercia, the land I served, the land I am most proud to have given those years of my life. And at this, she stepped back, not without catching Miral's eye. He did not have to nod and smile at her, but in doing so, it made Osrith feel the most sure she had ever felt in offering herself up to Ethelfled rather than return to Deheubarth with Hywel. Father Oswald then crossed between her and Ethelfled. He said nothing to her, but stood before the people with a comfortable, well-practiced manner. I will hear your oath on the book, Father Oswald told her, and placed in his hand a copy of the Bible. It had a lattice-work inscription on the front of it, and Osrith recognized it as one of many Alfred had commissioned to be sent to all bishoprics in the country. "Do you swear, on the book of our Lord, and his holy word, that all you confided to me was truth?" Osrith stepped towards her nephew, looking between the Bible and his face. "I will swear," Osrith said, "but I do not recognize this book," she continued. "Osrith," she heard behind her, and Aldhelm's words came to her ears. "You play a dangerous game. I believe you carry with you a book just as holy." To give him his due, Oswald was unmoved. But she had seen a copy of the British Gospels, created at Lindisfarne, in a stack of books in the antechamber. It must have been his, Osrith reasoned, and he would know the significance. They were Oswald's Gospels, commissioned by the king, late saint, in his lifetime, and it had given her joy to see them, for she thought them lost with the Danish and Norse raids. "What is she doing?" hissed Muriel from within the crowd. "They are the Gospels of Iona," Eswe said to Angus and Phelim. "She is showing she is a true ally to Alba and Constantine." The gold shone up from the pages, and Osrith smiled at the illuminated pages. Even Ethelfled could not object to these, so famous that they were, that even her father had used much gold to locate their whereabouts and bring them to Winchester. He had failed, and they had been with St. Oswald in his burial tomb in Bardney, and Osrith had been delighted to pass them on to the Bishop of Lixefeld, who had clearly passed them to the Bishop of Cester. "I know," Elfrith told him, reaching for his hand for a moment. "She is proving she is of Mercia." "Our servant Osrith," Father Oswald spoke, loud and commanding. "On these our most holy Gospels, do you swear your testimony to be true?" Osrith lowered her right hand to the pages, hardly daring to touch the centuries-old parchment with her palm. Then, she placed her left, her damaged hand, over the right, and Oswald placed his over hers. "I do," she said, making sure she was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Then, I will say this," Oswald said, holding the Gospels high, and at an angle for all to see. "I have heard your confession. The Witan of Our Lady Ethelfled have convened, and you are guilty of the killing of the Lord Eardwulf." "Good," thought Osrith, as a murmur went through the crowd. She glanced down, and noticed there was more than a murmur. A figure was pushing themselves through the crowd. She stood at the edge and looked across to Father Oswald, glancing at Ethelfled, and then at Ethelstan, who was standing beside his own aunt. "No," Edith protested. "No. If she is guilty, it is because of her love for the Lord Ethelred." Osrith turned her head. This was what Ethelfled had wanted to be kept from public ears. But the victim's sister was here, and having her say. "This warrior," Edith continued, "did act out of grief for her lord." "And what grief it was!" "I witnessed the murder of the Lord Ethelred." She was addressing all of the crowd now. "I saw how my brother tightened the tourniquet of bandages around the skull of our Lord, crushing it beyond any hope of life for him. I fled," Edith continued to nod around at the crowd, "to defend my lady's daughter from a marriage to him, so he would become lord, not what Ethelfled would want shared." Yet, she had shunned Edith too, when she could have had a governess, a caretaker, of Elfwyn, but she had chosen to drive her away and, ultimately, into the arms of her lover, Uhtred. "If Osrith is guilty in the eyes of the law, then she by my hand." At this, she raised a milk-white arm and held a dainty hand towards the Gospels. It was shaking a little, as Osrith's had been. No simple words scratched into cleaned cow skin. These were the words of God made physical so they could be seen by all. "I swear here," she said, and Osrith admired her humility, for the woman had reined herself unsuitably to be acceptable when she bowed her head to Father Oswald. Osrith's nephew held out the Gospels to her and she placed a hand steadily above the pages, not quite touching the page, then placed her left one over her right, as Osrith had done. Father Oswald placed a hand on top of Edith's flame-red head and said a small prayer, closing his eyes as he did so. The congregation waited until he had removed his hand, and Edith bowed, and moved off back to the crowd. Ethelfled, meanwhile, had taken a few steps to Osrith and spoke near her ear. "If you think coming to me with this confession now will save you," she hissed, "think again, for my judgment will not make a concession for your condition. You know I cannot hang a pregnant woman. Whatever your judgment, I would see this pregnancy through." Osrith hissed back, "Lodge the child with its father and then submit." Osrith turned her head. "What you fail to understand, Ethelfled, is that I am a warrior first and foremost. My sword is my life, defense of my lord is my purpose." Around them, people heard their words, if not all understood them. "And I failed my lord Ethelred when I acted in haste and did not allow Edwulf to live to stand trial." Osrith glanced at the crowd. "They need to know your judgment, lady," she added. Now Edith had disappeared. Ethelfled stood upright, and walked across to the front of the steps. Father Oswald closed the Gospels and stepped backwards. "We have heard all," Ethelfled told her people. "In light of new evidence, a witan will be called. The accused," and here Ethelfled turned her cold gaze to Osrith, "will remain here, under guard until we reconvene. Before we leave, are there any more people who will stand for this warrior?" At first, there was no movement, and Ethelfled made to turn. As she did so, a quiet murmuring came from the crowd as people were pushing forward. Osrith could not see exactly who they were until they had passed by Aldhelm, and it was only then that she felt overwhelmed to see her men, the men she had captained, for months, for years, their well-being she had managed, their glory she had promoted. It was all Osrith could do to stop her gathering them around her, clapping them on their back. It was Elfkin she saw first, tall, broad, blonde, followed by Egelfrith, his younger, leaner brother. Oshir, brown-haired and stoic, stood next to them, and last of all, her friend for the longest time, Elfrith. Osrith nodded to them, "Captain," once more. But then she saw Miral, her commander, stand beside Elfrith. Her division, Miral said simply. When Aldhelm raised his eyebrows, "Her men." "Not so," came a voice from the crowd, and, stalking between the mercenaries were Constantine's lords. Engus and Phelim stood to her right, and Eswi at the end. How was it that she was so blessed? Osrith asked herself. "You may have a long wait," Osrith told the men of Alba, in Gaelish. "Then we wait," Engus the Mormor told her. "Your man here," he gestured to Miral, "has told us we are free to go when the Norse allow our ship to leave. So we are in no hurry." Osrith nodded, and then turned to Elfrith, and said the same. "Do you think the men whose reputation you are defending here would be anywhere else other than by your side?" he asked. And Osrith nodded in return, and went back to listening to the blufferings of the geese that were making their homes in the Mercy's shadows and the thin cloud coverings which stretched thinly over blue heavens. After a time, Osrith felt a hand on hers. Her oldest comrade, loyal to the last. She turned her head to Elfrith, and Miral glanced over to her. "Never have I felt as proud of you, Osrith Lackland, than today." He nodded, and Osrith remembered the crabby, bad-tempered young captain she had been under, in Order's guard. Would the younger Miral have believed her? Osrith wondered. Had she been able to tell him? She laughed to herself. Just once. Elfrith leaned across to Phelim. The Pitlander looked back to him, narrowing his eyes, and narrowed his lips. There was Catrage, as well, he conceded. "Northumbrians," nodded Elfrith, nodding to the man. They waited. 88,888,888. Ethelfled's next move was one that Osrith did not expect. It may have been an hour or it may have been 2 when she stepped out of the hall and stood before her people again. She scanned the crowd and then spoke hastily to Aldhelm, who strode into the mass of people emerging with Edith. Osrith watched as the woman stood before Ethelfled, and inclined her head. Briefly. "You are the sister of the lord who was slain," Ethelfled said. "I am." "And did you see Osrith, former captain of the Mercen Guard, cut down your brother?" "There was pleasure in that, former," Osrith could hear. "I believe it was in error," said Edith replied, not taking her eyes of Ethelfled. Osrith turned to stare at her. Grief, shock, all cloud the mind. She was recovering, and still is recovering from great trauma. "I witnessed Eadgilf kill my brother, and I believe Osrith heard me say that." "Nevertheless, You did kill a lord of my land? Ethelfled now turned to Osrith. You will speak? She shouted. Of course I'll speak, thought Osrith, dully. Yes. And your men? She looked at the mercenaries beside Osrith. They witnessed this too? Osrith turned to them, giving them her sternest look. Tell the truth, was what she meant by that look. Yes, they all agreed. You may go. She nodded to Edith, then bent briefly to Aldhelm, who crossed to Osrith, and placed a hand firmly on her shoulder. I am sorry to be the one to do this, he said, and took her by the arm to stand in the very centre of the steps. Osrith Lackland, of Strathclyde. Osrith heard Angus shout, then heard Felimad, Alba, and at least one of her men shout, Mercia. Ethelfled, if she heard them at all, continued stolidly. You are judged by myself, as the ruler of this land of Mercia, in an emergency written, to be guilty. It only remains to pass sentence. I understand you have received word, Gerald. This interruption came from Aldhelm, who called down to Edith, who was standing before the crowd and was looking up at the proceedings. Beautiful eyes, open and alert. She looked to Aldhelm. Ethelfled bridled at the interruption, but said nothing. I have, Edith confirmed, then stepped up to the first step and repeated loudly, I have. And was it enough? Aldhelm pressed. It was more than enough, Edith assured him, again, loud enough for all to hear. There is another witness. This time it was Osrith who spoke. Another witness, my lord, she said to Aldhelm. Who, Osrith? Aldhelm asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Lord Ethelstan. And, whether Ethelfled wanted him to or not, the black-haired boy, young man now at aged about 14 or 15, came to stand by his aunt. It is true, I witnessed it, as did your own daughter, Elfwin. Ethelstan was clear and to the point. She would say the same as I. Osrith Lackland did indeed kill the Lord Eardwulf. Then she was out of her mind, Ethelfled concluded, glancing at Osrith's stomach. And as such, so a disturbed mind is a woman's mind? Osrith asked. You are suggesting a woman is unfit in a position of power, Lady Ethelfled? One with child may make irrational judgments, the Lady of the Mercenaries admitted. And it was true. She had made an irrational judgment over Eric when pregnant with Elfwin. She knew Osrith knew that very well. Then I am guilty, Osrith proclaimed. For there can be no other conclusion. Guilty, Ethelfled surmised, and looked around at her people again, making sure she was well heard. My sentence is this. When you have had your child, you will return to Mercia, you shall be taken to a place of execution. But the rest of her sentence, whatever that might have been, was drowned out by the uproar, from the congregation before her, from Osrith's warriors behind. Even Aldhelm recoiled. In the noise, few saw the Lord Ethelstan lean across to his aunt and confide something. Ethelfled held up a hand. A place of execution, to witness how justice should be done, lest you do not make the same mistake again. She had tried, Osrith thought, she would give Ethelfled that. But no one could be convinced that the Lady of the Mercenaries really meant it, or had intended to say it. Ethelfled had not played the publicity well. She had said it, however, and stood at the front of all her men, her warriors, her people. And you will serve Mercia in her armies for a period of 2 years at a time I or my successor sees fit. My thanks, Lady Ethelfled, for judging me under Mercian law has demonstrated that I am, indeed, a Mercian. Ethelfled turned her head to her. Constantine said he would send me aid one day, she replied, as the crowd, encouraged by Aldhelm, dispersed. Osrith made sure she did not look at the people too closely. She would not be distracted by Uhtred or his men. I did not expect to pass over the deed to give it to you, Osrith replied, nor these warriors be blocked in on the Merce. I am glad your commander gave them the chance you would not give them. She glanced across to Aldhelm, who had ordered Miral to hold Constantine's men at spear point again. How dare she, Osrith thought, after everything. When she held a letter that Ethelfled wanted her to take back to Constantine about some sort of alliance, Osrith turned to the young man to the left of Ethelfled. Ethelstan, it is good to meet you. I have not been introduced. Aethelstan replied, a smaller imitation of his aunt's Ice Queen manner. It is so that your lady failed to overlook one of Mercia's captains. For I served your land well for a number of years. You were late to the battle, lady. We were in East Anglia, Ethelfled admitted. Ah, yes, commanding Edward's men. Osrith shifted her weight between her feet. As I recall, you used to commit your poor brother's toys to the fire, upsetting an 8-year-old just to watch him cry. I see nothing has changed. She saw Aethelstan reach for his sword, but Osrith was quicker, and Buer was in her hand. He stopped, without breaking eye contact. Try it, and it will be Elf who succeeds to the crowns, Osrith told him. I have killed, Aethelstan informed her, still looking at her. And I will do so again. Osrith smiled, and shook her head. If you had wanted me dead, I would be dead. What is your purpose? One day I will be Lord of Mercia. I understand you have sworn to Mercia. I did, Osrith admitted. I have. And I have 2 years' service indentured. It was beginning to sink in. She had pulled it off, cleared the names of her men, restored her reputation. Then I humbly accept your service, nodded Aethelstan, and his voice took on a humble tone, respectful. She turned. And when I am free to fulfill my oath, Osrith said, with deliberate purpose, my blade will be yours. Osrith lowered Buer a little but was met with Ethelfled's blade. Steel meeting steel, and saw the ring of Mercia again. Green set in gold, that had been passed from ruler to ruler since the first tickling, the first leader of the Angles in the middle of the Heptarchy. Yet, Ethelfled was also a Ifing, a Saxon from the line of Iffa who had begotten the West Saxons. Not today, Ethelfled said, shaking herself as if ridding herself of an irritating wasp and handing her sword back to Aethelstan. You are no longer for Edward, then. And you would take Wessex from him, Osrith scorned, like you would steal his toys when he was but a child, because you were jealous you could not succeed Alfred's crown. Osrith stood still, awaiting for the blow to come, for Ethelfled to strike her, and she saw the Lady of the Mercens raise her hand, but pull it down to her side at the last moment. More than that, Aethelstan had also seen it. She waved to Aldhelm. Imprison these men, she told him, and although they didn't understand, Felim, Engus and Eswi got the idea. But Osrith stood in front of Aldhelm. If you take his men, you are fighting Constantine, Osrith told her. So there was little point in troubling yourself with a letter, lady. It will not matter, Aethelstan told her. When my turn comes, I will rule all of Britain, and Alba too. He says he will take all of Britain, Osrith told the Mormers, who laughed, and in Gaelish, again, told Aethelstan, you will try. Constantine respects that. My father was right, Ethelfled told her. You cannot trust a Gael. Then it is you who are foolish. Did you not treat with Constantine at Heavenfield? That stopped her, and Ethelblad dipped her head. He is indeed a fortunate man to have such an intelligent woman as the mother of his child, Ethelfled told her, gesturing a hand to Aldhelm to let the men go. It is a common mistake that many people seem to be making. You are in good company. Ethelfled gave a hmph but said nothing, then walked past Osrith as if she did not exist. 2 years for Mercia, Osrith told herself. Well, she would make sure it would be when it suited her. Then, she noticed all of her men had come to stand by her. A drink, Elfrith declared. Eswi? He asked. Drink? You understand? I can speak English, Eswi told him. And you drink ale from Buxton, and your commander drinks local Aylesbury beer. Constantine has his spies too, it would appear, Miral chuckled. And then an almighty crash came from beyond Brunanburgh's fortress, before a rhythmical thumping, sword, spear, axe on shield. Miral raced to the palisade and called up to the men on guard. But there was no need for him to act as intermediary, nor as translator. For the warrior aloft screamed but one thing, over and over, in a language universal to everyone. Norse, he shouted. The Norse are invading. Osrith inhaled deeply and turned to her men. She noticed Ethelfled, however, racing out of the hall over to Aethelstan. Looks as if I am to begin serving my time to you now, lady, Osrith called, her life given meaning once again. The Norse were invading, and she was in the fortunate position to have fought with every one of the men who had stood by her. Literally, at her trial, the Norse would meet its match with her division. 88,888,888. I have seen her, I must go to her. Finan's voice was one filled with piteous sadness. He had watched everything from the very back of the crowd. Though his eyesight was incredible, his hearing was not. She was brave, I will admit, said Osferth. Not many people would call their own trial. She did that? Cihric asked, placing a hand on Osferth's shoulder, for the baby monk was just about to walk away. Osferth nodded. So Utad said, "Come on, you slow bastards." Utad was at the palisade gate and was beckoning to them. At the other, Osrith with her men. Not one of them had told her not to fight though. If she were honest, she probably should not have been fighting at all. But she had men, with different skills around her, and while they spoke different tongues and held their weaponry differently to one another, Osrith knew that lead them all was the key to victory. She knew that Elfrith and Felim worked alone, and would take everything into consideration before they attacked. A hugely different approach to Engus and Miral who, though different in build, would tear onto the battlefield facing each danger fiercely and systematically. Her quiet Oshir would be thinking about his move before going on to a flurry of execution. Then there were the all-rounders, Elfrith, Eglfrith, Eswi. But there was a difference in culture. How could they go out to a battlefield wearing different clothing, with different blades, different war cries? The Gale and the two Cymric would tear into battle with the hollow yelling cry she had learned when fighting with them, in contrast to the Saxons, who roared very little. What could unite them? This was proven to Osrith when she tried to move with her men. When the Mercian warriors went with her, the men of Alba remained where they were. "They are the enemy to us," Felim replied in Pictish. "Say," he added, and Osrith saw the recognition of the word on Miral's face. "They are my men, were my men, in Mercia, not 2 months ago," she told them. "They may be your enemy in the future, but not today." Elfkin and Eglfrith stopped their advance and went to stand beside Oshir and Elfrith. "Of Alba?" asked Miral. Osrith nodded, and he turned to Engus. "She is with child, and surely must be resting," he told the Strathclyde Morma. "In our land, it is custom to let the woman decide," Eswi told him. "She is dear to us," Miral insisted, advancing him one step. "Too. Aye, to us too," Engus replied, fiercely. And then, Osrith felt old and tired, and wanted the fireside and rest. Her bones ached. She felt insulated by the care these men, who she had spent time building bonds with, showing respect to and having the privilege to manage, were showing her, and knew she could only go to safety if she found something to unite them. "Listen." Osrith did not mean to shout as loud as she had. When she had looked at all men, who were giving her their attention, she said again at a more suitable volume, "My brother once told me, although he did not know it was me," Osrith said, "about a whore who was a bishop's wife. I stole a good deal of his money from him when he was busy admiring her." "You don't mean ... Gomer?" Bishop Leofstan's wife. Aldhelm asked her, shocked. "She was called Mess when I first met her," Miral told him. "Funny, how they are in Cester now," he added. "Not too far from Brunanburg." "I do mean her," Osrith clarified, and she saw Elfkin and Oshir shuffle their feet. She had seen her once, and she had indeed been beautiful, dainty, poised, and Osrith had stolen her brother's silver when Utad had been distracted. "We are in need," a battle cry, and those who have met us will know that we are fighting to protect all in Mercia, including those who give warriors so much pleasure when they return from battle. "Famous," she declared, then spent a moment translating for Engus, Felim and Eswi who, after a moment's delay laughed too. "Mus." They all shouted. From across the other side of the palisade, the message must have been heard, and a response was shouted back. "Mus." The best whore in the British Isles. 88,888,888. The Mercians had assembled around the ramparts of Brunanburg, assembling for the fight, with West Saxons to their left, huddling together to give the greatest density of bodies. Amongst them, Utad's men. One of them could see across the field, could see Osrith with warriors around her. "It is Osrith," Finan declared. his eyes right. Utad next to him spat. What does that bitch want now? Utad groaned. Pain from his healing wound from ice spite needling him. Finan said nothing for a moment, but when she withdrew her seeks, he stepped past Utad. Look at her, Utad declared. She should be sitting indoors waiting for the bratling to be born, not fighting. She is no better than she should be. And what should she be? Finan asked. Not so arrogant. Not so carefree. She dances into a fight as if the world is going to part before her magnificent self. He scorned. She fights like you, Lord Utad, Sihrik said, with a grin. She does not. Utad rounded on his warrior. She does, Finan replied, watching her. Beyond them, a fight had broken out between the West Saxons and a Mercian division. On her horse, Ethelfled was going over to it, and when they saw her, men withdrew their weapons. No longer Mercia and Wessex. Everyone heard her declare, but Saxons and Angles, one. Osrith heard, and glanced at Miral and Elfrith. She means just today, Elfrith said aloud. We are not a union of kingdoms, we are separate nations, and will remain so. Sihrik moved across to Finan when the battle lines moved. They were nearer the front, where the bravest men stood. What would you tell her? Asked Sihrik, who had had his own share of maligning from Utad about his wife. That I love her. I don't need to own her to love her. I can love her without expectations. Then go to her, Sihrik encouraged, glancing at the ranging Norse. Before we begin here, tell her 88,888,888. Why do they fight now? It was Elfkin who asked Osrith that as they slowly progressed over what would be the battlefield. Along the bank of the Merse, ships, so many she could not see across to the land on the other side of the river. It's nearly Advent, he added, Christmas. Osrith looked at her youngest warrior, but it was Eswi who answered.